For us, outside the EU and unsure now about our relations with Trump, I think if we are being forced to make a big strategic choice, we have to choose Europe. Brexit took us out of its marketplace, but also out of an infuriatingly slow-moving, pious, and not particularly democratic political system. I don't want to go back to that. But instinctively, in our values, at this crunch moment, could we really side with this American leader doing and saying these things? In a moment, I'm going to talk to Douglas Alexander, the Scottish Secretary, but also the former Trade Minister and a man who knows American politics very well. But there are questions which are even harder-edged about what happens if the US actually does send troops into Greenland soon, and what our defences will look like if America was suddenly removed from the alliance. To deal with that, let's begin tonight with General Sir Richard Shirreff, the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and author of War with Russia, An Urgent Warning. Where did he think the US leaving NATO would leave us militarily?
In not a good place. But it would mean that Europe, the European member states of NATO, and Canada would be forced now to think through a new security architecture for the transatlantic region, less America. I don't think it necessarily means creating a new organization. I do think it would make sense to build it on the foundations of the old America plus NATO, because if America is no part of that alliance, there is still a command structure, there is still a doctrine, there is still interoperability, there are procedures and processes, and an understanding of multinationality which has underpinned the alliance and done it very well in its 76 years. So build on that.
Still very well worth having. But of course, under these circumstances, I assume Britain loses her nuclear deterrence.
Well, Britain has a so-called independent nuclear deterrence, but it is dependent on America. I understand it. I'm not a nuclear expert for servicing and the like. So I think that must be an assumption.
Given that Russia, the former Soviet Union, then Russia, has tried for so long, so desperately, to break the transatlantic alliance, and that it seems to be very close to breaking right now this evening because of an American president, can you reflect on the damage that Donald Trump has so far done to NATO?
Catastrophic. It's very difficult to see how NATO can come back from this as a unified alliance with the levels of total trust that underpinned it for 76 years, or at least until President Trump's first tour. So this is a potential disaster for NATO. The idea, the very notion that this alliance in which collective defense has been founded on the premise that an armed attack on one is an attack on all, is now facing the threat, the very real threat of military action being taken by its lead nation, America, on another NATO ally. And don't forget, of course, he's already threatened another NATO ally's territorial integrity with Canada.
Canada, absolutely. If the worst happens, and we just have to follow through the dire logic in this situation, and we have American troops in Greenland firing on and perhaps killing European troops, at that moment, is that when all the American air bases in Germany and in this country and around Europe are closed? Do you think that's the kind of action we might see being taken by the Europeans?
Very probably. And let me just say here that this has come about because people have not taken Trump literally. And one's been saying for about a year now, we have to assume that with Trump, the worst than worst case will apply. And this is absolutely what has happened now. So to your question about what actions might be taken, this is what needs to be this is what needs to be happening now. Wargaming, thinking through the implications of the scenario you've described, American troops launching military action against NATO, European troops in Greenland. This is what needs to be going on now in Whitehall and in all European NATO capitals and in Brussels as well, led by Mr. Rutte, who has been very quiet on this. Yeah, it's about wargaming any potential contingency and actions to be taken should the worst happen, because we have to assume the worst will happen.
Final blunt question. Without America, there's still Russia there. They're no doubt hooting with laughter at the moment. Could we defend ourselves against Russia without America?
We're going to have to. And if we bring together the nations of NATO, the 31 nations of NATO, with their combined GDPs, their combined populations, their combined military forces, as they are, however lacking in capability they might be at the moment, and I'm thinking of the hollow nature of our own armed forces, we still have the means to overmatch and outdo Russia. So we have to assume, that we can, and it's going to be a come-as-you-are party.
Sir Richard Shirreff, a very solemn evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Well, the politics of all of this are agonising. My next guest has been sitting around the cabinet table while, I guess, ministers agonise. Let's welcome Douglas Alexander, the Secretary of State for Scotland. Douglas, we just heard a very, very senior ex-military commander from NATO there talking about the possibility of us closing American bases in the UK and across the EU. Is that the kind of game playing, the kind of thinking that's going on inside government as well?
No, the approach that we're taking was set out, first of all, by the Prime Minister to the President yesterday and then by the Prime Minister to the country this morning. If you're a commentator, a former general, however distinguished, you have the privilege of,
talking
if
frankly.
you like, talking, a series of hypotheticals. And frankly, we are very clear that we need to deal with what is undoubtedly a very serious situation. How are we planning on dealing with this? By advancing certain core interests of the United Kingdom. Firstly, that the defence of the Arctic actually is multilateral in character. If you look at where the Russian Northern Fleet has to pass through in order to reach the North Atlantic or Britain's shores, it has to pass through the Arctic. Secondly, that the alliance on which our collective security has been based for 75 years, the NATO alliance, is not amenable to arguments about tariffs. We need to find ways of resolving our differences internally, because as you suggested, the beneficiaries, if we weaken NATO, will be our adversaries such as Russia. And thirdly, we do want to get around the table and spend this week lowering the temperature and de-escalating rather than engaging in making a splash even on LBC. We're more interested in making a difference.
I absolutely get that, and I think the Prime Minister, as I've said, did that very, very well this morning. Nonetheless, these are really, really serious challenges for any British government and for the British state. I mean, if the Americans withdrew from NATO, we would presumably lose our nuclear deterrent just like that.
Well, the truth is that is not a scenario that we are either seeking or contemplate.
We may have no choice.
Because, well, if you look at the approach that is being taken, not only has NATO been the foundation stone of our security for 75 years, but also the United States' advantage throughout the Cold War was that it had allies. I'm one of the older members of the government. I served in a previous government at the time of 9/11. The only occasion on which Article 5 of the NATO treaty has been triggered has been in defence of the United States. A great personal friend of mine, Nick Burns, who served as Joe Biden's ambassador in Beijing, was the US ambassador to NATO. He took the call from, at the time, the Canadian ambassador, spoke to Condoleezza Rice in the White House and agreed that Article 5 should be triggered. Not only was that a legal judgment, it was a practical lived reality. I saw for myself in forward operating base in Afghanistan, not only the courage and heroism of British troops, but of Danish troops as well.
Absolutely.
So one of the arguments we will be advancing
is that memory of this in Trump.
Well, that's one of the arguments we will be advancing, which is the United States without allies is weaker and less powerful, not stronger and more powerful.
Can be absolutely clear, we are not under any circumstances going to retaliate with tariffs of our own.
Well, the Prime Minister made clear today that he does not regard a trade war as being in anybody's interest. He was clear about that. And that's because, as I say, words matter when it comes to diplomacy. And I appreciate that it may make for rather dull radio, but it makes for critical diplomacy. Because at this point, speculating on hypotheticals is frankly of no one's interests and serves no one other than those who want to see the Atlantic grow a bit wider and the NATO alliance weakened.
But also, this is, I think, an expression of the bleeding obvious. In a trade war with the United States, we would be the losers.
Well, this is not the first time we've seen a movie whereby the President of the United States stands up and announces that there's going to be uniform tariffs. We saw that in what they called World Liberation Day or World Tariff Day back last year. And so in that sense, it's not just that we've seen this movie before, we've played our part in that movie before. We went to work with quiet, disciplined diplomacy, and we secured not only the first deal, but the best deal of any country as a consequence of that. So there is a playbook by which
that's been
to try and navigate between, if you like, the signal and the noise coming from the president. Of course, he makes a great deal of announcements, and one of the challenges in chancelleries, in prime ministers' offices, and in presidential palaces around the world is to interpret the difference between the words and the action. But we've had the threat of tariffs, for example, in the film industry. We've had the threat of tariffs of anybody trading with Iran.
Are you saying you're not taking this seriously?
No,
because
I'm saying
if he
quite the
imposes
reverse.
these tariffs on the car industry, the steel industry, pharmaceuticals, it would be devastating.
I am
for
saying
us.
quite the reverse. I'm saying that if you want evidence as to how we will approach this challenge, look at how we approach that challenge. We recognise that, for example, Jaguar Land Rover and its huge supply chain across the UK was largely reliant on what is the largest single trading partner we have of any country, which is the United States. About 18% of the UK's international trade is with the United States. We are respectively the largest inward investor to the United States, and it's the largest inward investor into the United Kingdom. So we take this very seriously, but that shapes the tone, the modality of our diplomacy, as well as the substance of our diplomacy.
Meanwhile, post-Brexit, the EU is going to says they're going to slap huge tariffs in retaliation on the United States. They're talking about selling off American Treasury bonds and hitting the dollar. They're talking about doing deals with China and all of that. Is there not a danger that we are left, as it were, with Trump's America on one side and a much more militant EU on the other, and not with the kind of big diplomatic voice we'd like to have?
So one of the many fictions that was peddled by the Brexiteers was that somehow a post-Brexit Britain would stand taller in Moscow or Beijing or in Washington. They also promised us back in 2016 that, if you like, we would have a functioning international trading system, a functioning World Trade Organization, and major trading powers, the European Union, China, and the United States, that actively wanted to do trade deals with post-Brexit Britain. The reality is we've seen a much more regionalised, much more protectionist, frankly, much more geopolitically contested world than was ever contemplated. That's why I take a certain pride in the fact that, with Keir Starmer in the lead, but great work being done by Nick Thomas-Symonds out at the Cabinet Office, we have systematically sought to strengthen and deepen our trading relationships with Europe over the course of the last 18 months.
And can that go further?
Absolutely. What we announced last May when we had the first UK-EU summit was that this was the start, not the end, that there would be annual summits each year. And if you like, how did we approach that? It started in the same way, ironically, that Keir Starmer has done with President Trump, with their rather unlikely friendship, with the personal relationships, starting to rebuild the level of trust on the other side of the channel that people felt in the UK government that had been trashed, if you remember, by Liz Truss saying she couldn't answer the question as to whether President Macron was a friend or a foe.
Is that unlikely friendship still alive?
I think it is. The fact is, a phone call happened yesterday, and I know that after the cavalcade of clowns we had in the UK trying to manage international relations and shredding our trust and credibility as a result, that we should be deeply grateful that in Keir Starmer we have a serious leader in what are undoubtedly serious times. It is an unlikely friendship, but it's a precious friendship because it's what has delivered, with the Friends of Ukraine, a significant degree of work diplomatically in bringing Europe and the United States together. This week it falls to Keir Starmer again to try and undertake that difficult, challenging, often private, but critical work for the UK's national interest.
Very hard indeed. Douglas Alexander, thank you so much for that.